The howling wind of Xylos was the only companion Elric had known for the past 3 years. It sang its mournful song, rattling the reinforced windows of his isolated cabin, a small bastion of warmth in the vast, frozen wasteland. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, thick flakes of snow swirling in chaotic patterns visible in the dim light cast from his windows. Elric poked at the embers in his modest fireplace, watching as sparks danced upward only to disappear into the darkness. The crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind had become a strange, comforting symphony to him. They filled the silence that would otherwise consume him, the silence that would force him to face the ghosts of his past. His cabin was sparse but functional, military precision evident in how everything had its place. A former soldier, Elric had chosen this desolate outpost on the ice planet Xylos specifically for its isolation. Here, at the edge of colonized space, he could escape both the memories of war and the personal losses that had shattered his spirit. The bitter cold of Xylos matched the frozen state of his heart, and he had made peace with that symmetry. A small shelf of physical books, a rarity in this age, stood against one wall. A workbench cluttered with repair projects occupied another. His bed, neatly made with thermal blankets, stood in the corner. Simple, austere, alone, just how he preferred it. Elric added another log to the fire and settled into his worn armchair, preparing for another evening of solitude. Outside, the blizzard intensified, the wind screaming with such force that it sounded almost like a knock. Elric's head snapped up, the sound so unexpected that for a moment he believed he had imagined it. 3 years on Xylos, and not once had anyone approached his cabin. The nearest settlement was over 80 kilometers away, and no one traveled during storm season. Another knock, weaker this time, barely audible above the storm's rage. Rising cautiously, Elric reached for the pulse rifle he kept mounted near the door, a habit from his military days. He approached the entrance silently, years of combat training evident in his movements. The security scanner showed heat signatures outside, not one, but 3. Too small to be predators, and Xylos had few indigenous species that could survive its harsh climate anyway. Keeping the rifle ready but lowered, Elric unlocked the heavy metal door and pulled it open just enough to see outside. The biting cold immediately rushed in, along with a swirl of snow that melted instantly on the warm floor of his cabin. What stood before him made his hand tighten instinctively on his weapon. A woman, no, not human, a female figure with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer even in the dim porch light. Her eyes, large and almond-shaped, were a striking violet that seemed to glow with an inner light. Sthari. He recognized the species from his military deployments, though he had never interacted with them directly. They were a peaceful race from a distant system, rarely seen this far from their homeworld. She was trembling violently, her thin frame draped in what appeared to be multiple layers of inadequate clothing, all crusted with ice and snow. But what truly caught Elric off guard were the 2 small figures clutching desperately to her sides, children. One slightly taller, perhaps 7 or 8 standard years, with features that mirrored the woman's, but with a hardened wariness in its eyes that no child should possess. The other, smaller and clearly weaker, seemed barely conscious, its tiny head lolling against the woman's hip. "Please," the Sthari woman whispered, her voice cracking with the cold and exhaustion. Her words were accented, but clear and standard. "Shelter. Just for tonight." Elric remained frozen, his mind racing. 3 years of perfect isolation about to be shattered. He could turn them away, direct them to the settlement. It wasn't his problem that they had chosen to travel in a storm. It wasn't his responsibility. Then the Sthari woman spoke again, words that would forever alter the course of his existence. "I will warm your bed, human." Her voice was flat, desperate, devoid of seduction or promise, merely stating a transaction. "My children need a father." Elric's eyes widened at the blunt proposal, seeing it for what it was, not an offer of intimacy, but a last desperate bargain from someone with nothing left to trade but herself. Her gaze didn't waver from his, dignity somehow intact despite the degradation of having to make such an offer. Before he could respond, the smaller child slumped further, a soft whimper escaping its blue lips. The sound cut through Elric's practiced attachment like a plasma blade. "Get inside," he said gruffly, stepping back and opening the door wider. Now, the relief that flooded the woman's face was momentary, instantly replaced by caution as she ushered the children in, her movements protective, keeping them slightly behind her as she entered. The older child, a boy, Elric now noted, kept wary eyes fixed on him, small hand clutching what appeared to be a crude, makeshift knife fashioned from scrap metal. "I don't need that," Elric said awkwardly, gesturing vaguely toward the woman as he secured the door against the storm. "Put your offer away. The children need warmth." He moved toward the fire, adding more logs and adjusting the thermal controls of the cabin to increase the ambient temperature. Behind him, he could sense the tense silence, the uncertainty. When he turned back, they remained huddled by the door, as if prepared to flee despite the deadly storm outside. "The small one needs immediate attention," Elric said, attempting to keep his voice neutral. "Bring her to the fire." "Her name is Alara," the woman said softly, yet with a hint of defiance, as if insisting on her child's identity rather than allowing her to be an anonymous burden. "And he is Kale." Names. They had names. Of course they did. Elric nodded stiffly, unprepared for the simple humanity of that fact. "And you?" he found himself asking. A pause. "Lyra." Elric gestured toward the fireplace again. "Bring Alara to the fire, Lyra." The formality of using their names seemed to ease something in the starry woman's posture. She guided the children toward the warmth, though Kale continued to watch Elric with unwavering suspicion. The little girl, Alara, was in worse condition than Elric had initially assessed. Her breathing was shallow, her small form shivering uncontrollably. "She needs more than just fire," Elric muttered, moving to a storage cabinet where he kept his emergency medical supplies. "How long were you out in the storm?" "Too long," Lyra replied, her hands gently stroking her daughter's frost-covered hair. "Our transport crashed 3 days ago. We've been walking since. 3 days in Xylos's wilderness. It was a miracle they were alive at all." Elric returned with a medical scanner and basic treatment kit. "I'm no doctor, but I have field medical training." Lyra nodded, carefully moving aside to allow him access to Alara, though she kept one hand protectively on the child's shoulder. The scanner confirmed what Elric suspected: moderate hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. Nothing life-threatening with proper care, but it had been a close call. "She'll recover," he said, preparing a warming pack and nutrient solution. "But she needs rest, warmth, and fluids." As he worked, Elric became acutely aware of Kale's scrutiny. The boy hadn't relaxed his grip on his makeshift weapon, and his eyes followed Elric's every movement with calculation beyond his years. "You too," Elric said, nodding toward Kale while administering the nutrient solution to Alara. "And your mother. You all need food and rest." He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the sudden domestic scene unfolding in his carefully maintained isolation. Moving to the small cooking area, he began preparing a simple stew, one of the few meals he bothered to make from the base ingredients in his stores rather than using the synthesizer. Behind him, he heard the soft murmurs of Lyra speaking to her children in their native tongue, the musical cadence so at odds with the harsh environment of Xylos. He tried not to listen, tried to maintain the emotional distance he had cultivated for years, but found himself straining to understand their alien words nonetheless. When he returned with bowls of steaming stew, Alara had fallen into an exhausted sleep, wrapped in thermal blankets near the fire. Kale remained vigilant, though hunger flashed in his eyes at the sight of food. Lyra looked up at Elric, confusion and wariness battling with gratitude on her delicate features. "Eat," Elric said simply, placing the bowls on a small table and retreating to his workbench, giving them space. The silence that filled the cabin was heavy, broken only by the storm outside and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Elric busied himself with a broken transceiver he'd been repairing, hyper-aware of the three unexpected visitors who had shattered his solitude. "Tomorrow," he said without looking up from his work, "when the storm breaks, I'll take you to the settlement at North Pass." He sensed rather than saw Lyra's tension at his words. "We cannot go to any settlement," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge of fear. Elric finally looked up, meeting her violet eyes across the room. "Why?" Lyra glanced down at her children, Cale now curled protectively around his sleeping sister, his own eyes fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. "They will find us there," she said simply. Elric waited, expecting more, but Lyra offered no further explanation. The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. They were running from something or someone. He should press for details. He should demand to know what kind of trouble she was bringing to his doorstep. Instead, he found himself saying, "Take my bed. I'll sleep here by the fire." Surprise flashed across Lyra's face, quickly masked. "The floor is more than we hoped for. We will not take your bed. It's large enough for the three of you," Elric insisted gruffly. "The children need proper rest." After a moment's hesitation, Lyra nodded. "Thank you." The simple words of gratitude hung awkwardly in the air. Elric wasn't sure how to respond, and used to such basic social interactions after years of isolation. He merely nodded and returned to his repair work, trying to ignore the alien presence that had invaded his carefully constructed sanctuary. Later, as the storm continued to rage outside and his unexpected guests slept in his bed, Elric sat before the dying fire, keeping watch. Sleep eluded him, his mind replaying Lyra's desperate words at his doorstep. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." He stared into the glowing embers, wondering what chain of events had led his starry mother to make such an offer to a stranger. What desperation drove her to seek shelter with an unknown human in the desolate wastes of Xylos? For the first time in years, Elric's isolation felt less like peace and more like emptiness. The next morning, the storm had subsided to a gentle snowfall, but Elric made no mention of taking them to the settlement. Instead, he silently prepared a simple breakfast, avoiding the questioning look in Lyra's eyes. The unspoken arrangement that they would stay, at least for now, settled between them like the fresh snow outside. Days passed in an uneasy coexistence. Elric maintained his distance, speaking only when necessary, retreating to his workbench or venturing outside to check his equipment whenever the close quarters became too suffocating. Lyra kept the children close, always watchful, always ready to flee, despite having nowhere to go. Alara recovered quickly, her resilience surprising Elric. Soon she was exploring the cabin with curious eyes, though never straying far from her mother or brother. Kale remained vigilant, his makeshift weapon always within reach, his eyes following Elric's every movement. They established an unspoken routine. Elric would prepare breakfast before heading outside for morning maintenance checks. Lyra would tidy the living space and help with basic chores, though she never touched his personal belongings without permission. The children would occupy themselves quietly, with Kale often whispering stories or lessons to Alara in their native language. They were careful guests, taking up as little space as possible, making minimal noise. At times, Elric would almost forget they were there, until he would turn and catch a glimpse of blue skin or hear the soft melodic tones of their language. It was during the evening of the 5th day that the first crack appeared in their careful distance. Elric was cleaning components of his heating system when a small shadow fell across his workbench. Looking up, he found Alara standing there, her violet eyes wide with curiosity. Kale was nearby, tense and ready to intervene, but allowing his sister this small exploration. "What is that?" Alara asked, pointing to a power converter in Elric's hands. Her standard was childishly accented but clear. Elric hesitated, and used to explaining his work to anyone, let alone a child. "It's a thermal power converter. It helps keep the cabin warm." Alara's eyes widened. "Is it broken?" "Just needs cleaning." She nodded solemnly, as if this was vital information. Then her gaze shifted to his hands, and specifically to the long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow on his right arm. "Did it hurt?" she asked. The directness of a child. Elric found himself answering before he could retreat behind his usual walls. Yes, but it was a long time ago. I have a hurt too, she said, rolling up the sleeve of her oversized shirt to reveal a small burn mark on her blue skin. From when our ship went down. From across the room, Elric saw Lyra tense at this mention of their crash, but she didn't intervene. Does it still hurt? Elric asked, surprising himself with the question. Lyra shook her head. Not anymore. Mama made it better. That's good, Elric said, awkward but genuine. Mothers are good at that. Lyra smiled then, a bright, uncomplicated expression that struck Elric with its innocence. It had been so long since anyone had smiled at him. Can I watch you fix it? She asked, pointing to the converter. Before Elric could respond, Kale was at his sister's side, murmuring something in their language and gently pulling her away. The boy's eyes met Elric's, not with the usual suspicion, but with a complex mixture of wariness and something like apologetic embarrassment for his sister's intrusion. She can stay, Elric found himself saying. If she wants to. Kale hesitated, clearly torn between protecting his sister and allowing her this small freedom. Elric realized then that the boy couldn't be older than 8 standard years, yet he carried himself with the burden of an adult. It was a familiar sight. Elric had seen it in refugee camps during the war, children forced to grow up too quickly, shouldering responsibilities beyond their years. Finally, Kale gave a slight nod and released his sister's hand, though he remained nearby, vigilant as ever. As Elric returned to his work, now narrating the process in simple terms for Lyra's benefit, he caught Lyra's gaze. The Sthari woman was watching the scene with an unreadable expression, part caution, part wonder, and something else Elric couldn't identify. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, the silence was less strained than before. Lyra asked questions about the cabin, about Xylos, about how Elric had learned to fix things. Her childish curiosity seemed to break through some of the ice that had formed around their coexistence. Later, as Elric prepared to take his usual place on the floor by the fire while the others took his bed, Lyra approached him. May I ask why? She said softly. Why what? Why you help us? Why you let us stay? You owe us nothing. Elric considered the question, unsure of the answer himself. You needed help, he finally said, the words inadequate even to his own ears. Lyra studied him, her violet eyes seeming to see beyond his gruff exterior. Many would turn away in need, especially when it comes with risk. What risk? Elric asked, though he already suspected the answer. Lyra glanced toward the children, now asleep in his bed. I am a widow, she said simply. In Sthari society, this is problematic. Elric waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. Our culture values family units, she continued, her voice low. A woman without a mate is considered unstable, a bad omen, especially with children. Her hands twisted together in a gesture of distress. After my bondmate died, I was given 2 choices. Immediate remarriage to a male chosen by the elders, or, her voice faltered, or, Elric prompted quietly, or surrender my children to be raised by a proper family unit. The pain in her voice was raw, unfiltered. The male they chose was cruel. I had seen how he treated others. I would not subject my children to that. Understanding dawned on Elric. So you ran. Lyra nodded, her posture both defiant and defeated. We are considered fugitives now. Any Sthari settlement would return us immediately. And human colonies. She hesitated. Relations between our species are still tentative at best. They would likely contact Sthari authorities rather than risk a diplomatic incident. The pieces fell into place, their desperation, their wariness, Lyra's shocking offer at his doorstep. They had nowhere to go, no safe harbor. You're off for, Elric said carefully. At the door, Lyra's blue skin darkened slightly. A blush, Elric realized. It was desperate and inappropriate. I apologize. It was survival, Elric corrected. For your children. Their eyes met in mutual understanding. Neither spoke of the unasked question that hung between them. How long could they stay? Rest, Elric finally said. You're safe tonight. As Lyra returned to her children, Elric settled onto his makeshift bedding by the fire, more troubled than he had been in years. Their presence had already begun to chip away at the frozen walls he had built around himself. Their story stirred empathy he thought long dead. Their vulnerability awakened protective instincts he had buried after the war. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, it brought dreams of his own past, dreams he had not allowed himself to have for years. The pattern of their days shifted subtly after that night. The careful distance remained, but the silence became less oppressive. Alara continued to shadow Elric when he worked inside the cabin, asking endless questions about tools and machines and how things worked. Kale maintained his watchfulness but began to help with small tasks, gathering firewood, checking external sensors, his movements mirroring Elric's with careful observation. Lyra and Elric spoke little, but their exchanges became more substantial when they did occur. She told him of her homeworld, a place of twilight skies and floating gardens. He shared small, safe fragments of his past, his training as a combat engineer, his knowledge of survival techniques. They existed in a fragile equilibrium, all aware of its temporary nature, but none willing to disrupt it. Until the equilibrium shattered on its own. It began with a cough. Small, seemingly insignificant. Kale tried to hide it, muffling the sound in his sleeve when he thought no one was looking. But by the next morning, the boy was burning with fever, his blue skin taking on an alarming grayish tinge. Elric found Lyra bent over her son before dawn, her expression frantic as she placed cooling cloths on his forehead. "How long has he been like this?" Elric asked, already reaching for his medical scanner. "It worsened through the night," Lyra said, her voice tight with fear. "I thought it was just fatigue or the adjustment to the cold, but the scanner's readings were concerning. Kale's temperature was dangerously high, his respiratory system showing signs of infection." Elric recognized the symptoms immediately. Frost lung, a common illness on Xylos that affected even humans adapted to the environment. For his Thari child, used to a warmer climate, it could be deadly. "He needs medication that I don't have," Elric said, checking his limited medical supplies. "This isn't something that will resolve on its own." "What can we do?" Lyra asked, her composure cracking as Kale's breathing became more labored. Elric's mind raced through options, none of them good. The settlement had a medical facility, but going there would risk exposure. His emergency beacon would bring help, but also official documentation and questions they couldn't answer. "There's a research station," he finally said, 30 kilometers south, unmanned most of the year, but stocked with emergency medical supplies. "I can go there." "In this weather?" Lyra looked toward the window, where another storm was building. "I have a terrain vehicle. I can make it." "I should go with you," Lyra began, but Elric shook his head. "Alara needs you, and Kale needs constant attention." He met her eyes directly. "You have to trust me, Lyra." Trust. Such a simple word for such a monumental request. Lyra looked down at her son, then at Alara, who was watching the scene with frightened eyes, and finally back to Elric. "I do," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "Please hurry." The journey to the research station was treacherous, the storm intensifying with each passing hour. Elric's terrain vehicle, designed for Xylos' harsh conditions, struggled against wind-swept drifts and ice formations that hadn't been there on his last visit months ago. The 30 kilometers stretched endlessly, and more than once Elric questioned his decision to make the journey. But the image of Kale's labored breathing drove him forward. The boy who watched him with such suspicion, who protected his sister with fierce determination, who never complained despite the hardships he had endured. A child shouldering adult burdens, a reflection that hit too close to home. By the time Elric reached the research station, the storm had reached full fury. The small facility, half buried in snow, was a welcome sight. Its automatic systems activated at his approach, lights flickering on as he forced the frozen door open. Inside, he moved quickly to the medical bay, searching through supplies for the specific antibiotics needed to treat frost lung. As he gathered the medications, his eyes fell on a communication terminal, fully functional, linked to the colonial network. He could send a message, alert the authorities. return to the established order of his life. Elric stared at the terminal for a long moment, then deliberately turned away, focusing instead on collecting additional supplies that might be useful. More thermal blankets, nutrition supplements formulated for non-human physiologies, even a few educational datapads that had been left behind. The return journey was even more harrowing, the storm now at its peak. Visibility reduced to mere meters, ice forming on the vehicle's external sensors. Elric drove with the focus and determination that had once made him an exemplary soldier, pushing through conditions that would have caused most to turn back. When the cabin finally came into view, a single light glowing through the wide-out conditions, something unexpected tightened in Elric's chest. Relief, certainly, but also something that felt strangely like homecoming. Lyra met him at the door, her face tight with worry. "Kale?" Elric asked immediately. "Worse," she said, leading him to the bed where the boy lay, his breathing shallow and ragged. Alara sat nearby, silent tears streaming down her face as she held her brother's hand. Elric moved with practiced efficiency, preparing the medication and administering it according to the instructions he had memorized at the research station. "This will help," he assured Lyra, trying to project a confidence he wasn't entirely sure he felt. "But will take time." The next hours blurred together as they took turns monitoring Kale, checking his temperature, ensuring he took fluids when briefly conscious. Alara refused to leave her brother's side and eventually fell asleep curled against him, her small hand still clutching his. It was during one of these quiet vigils, deep in the night, that the most significant crack in their carefully maintained walls appeared. "He's all I have left of Nevar," Lyra said softly, her eyes fixed on her son's face. "My bondmate. Sometimes when Kale looks at me with such seriousness, I see his father's eyes." Elric, seated across from her on the other side of the bed, remained silent, allowing her to speak. Nevar was a scientist. He discovered something politically inconvenient, something about resource allocation and corruption among the elders. Her fingers gently stroked Kale's forehead. "There was an accident in his laboratory. Very regrettable. Very thorough." The bitterness in her voice resonated with something deep in Elric's own experience. The recognition of systemic betrayal, of powers larger than oneself determining the course of one's life. After his death, things changed quickly. We were moved to assisted housing. My professional credentials were questioned. The children's education placement was re-evaluated. Lyra's voice remained steady, but her hand trembled slightly. Then came the remarriage directive, a union with Elder Korath's nephew, a man known for his traditional views on child-rearing and female compliance. "You chose exile instead," Elric observed quietly. Lyra nodded. "We left with nothing but what we could carry. Used all our remaining credits for passage on a cargo vessel. Then another. Then the small transport that crashed here." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I would choose it again. Every time." Her courage, her determination to protect her children at all costs, struck a chord in Elric that resonated painfully with his own past. "I had a family once," he found himself saying, the words emerging from a place he had kept locked away for years. "My wife, Sarah. Our daughter, Mira." Lyra's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected revelation, but she remained silent, waiting. "I was deployed with the Colonial Defense Force. Border disputes, mainly. Dangerous, but structured." His voice had taken on a distant quality. "There was an attack on our colony while I was away. Insurgents targeting military families to send a message." The memories flooded back, crystal clear despite his efforts to blur them with time and isolation. "I was too far away by the time I returned." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry," Lyra said simply, the words carrying genuine empathy rather than mere politeness. "I hunted them down," Elric continued, needing suddenly to confess this darkest chapter. "The insurgents. It wasn't sanctioned. I went AWOL, tracked them to their base. I was a combat engineer. I knew how to make things work and how to make them fail catastrophically." He stared at his hands, remembering the blood that had once covered them. "I killed 17 people. Some were combatants. Some weren't. The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. What happened after? Lyra asked quietly. Military tribunal. My service record and mental state were considered mitigating factors. Dishonorable discharge instead of imprisonment. His laugh was hollow. They recommended psychiatric treatment. I chose exile instead. Their eyes met across the sleeping children, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Both had lost everything. Both had chosen flight over submission. Both carried guilt and grief that had shaped their every decision since. We are not so different, Lyra said softly. Before Elric could respond, Cale stirred between them, his eyes fluttering open. Mama, he whispered, his voice raspy. The moment of connection shattered as Lyra immediately focused on her son, checking his temperature, offering him water. But something fundamental had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. A truth had been acknowledged. They were all damaged, all running, all seeking something they weren't sure existed anymore. Safety, peace, home. Cale's recovery was slow but steady. The medication fought the infection effectively, but the illness had weakened him considerably. For days, he was confined to bed, a situation the fiercely independent boy clearly hated. It was during this time that another shift occurred in their fragile household. Elric, recognizing Cale's frustration at his confinement, brought one of his repair projects to the bedside, a small drone used for external temperature readings that had malfunctioned during the recent storms. "Want to learn how it works?" he asked gruffly, not quite meeting the boy's surprised gaze. After a moment's hesitation, Cale nodded. Thus began a daily ritual. Elric bringing small mechanical problems for them to solve together, explaining principles of engineering and electronics that gradually drew the boy out of his shell. Cale proved to be a quick study, his questions becoming more advanced, his natural intelligence flourishing under Elric's patient instruction. Lyra watched these interactions with a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at her son's recovery, gratitude for Elric's efforts, and a growing warmth that she was careful not to examine too closely. For his part, Elric found himself looking forward to these sessions, experiencing a satisfaction in teaching that he had never anticipated. Alara, not to be left out, joined these lessons eagerly, though her interest leaned more toward the stories Elric reluctantly began to share about the worlds he had visited during his military service. Her favorite was his description of the floating gardens of Ethis, remarkably similar to Lyra's homeworld, where plants grew suspended in air currents, their bioluminescent blooms creating patterns that changed with the winds. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cabin transformed. Children's drawings appeared on the walls, Alara's colorful depictions of imagined worlds, and Cale's remarkably accurate technical diagrams. The strict order of Elric's possessions gave way to a more lived-in arrangement. Meals became social occasions rather than mere necessity, with conversation and even occasional laughter. One evening, as Elric returned from checking the perimeter sensors, he paused at the doorway to his cabin. Through the window, he could see Lyra sitting by the fire, reading to the children from one of his old paper books. The scene struck him with its simple domesticity, so at odds with the isolation he had chosen for himself. For a moment, he felt like an intruder in his own home. Then Alara spotted him and waved enthusiastically, her smile bright and uncomplicated. Cale looked up too, offering a more reserved but genuine acknowledgement. Lyra met his eyes over the children's heads, something unspoken passing between them. It was Alara who first voiced what had been gradually taking shape between them. "Are we staying here now?" she asked one morning over breakfast, the question landing with the impact of a dropped stone in still water. "Forever." The adults exchanged glances, neither prepared to answer. It was Cale, surprisingly, who broke the silence. "We can't stay forever," he said, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. "The bad people will keep looking for us. We're safe here," Alara insisted. "Elric won't let the bad people get us." The simple faith in her statement hung in the air. Elric found himself wanting, for the first time in years, to be worthy of such trust. "We've imposed on Elric's kindness too long already," Lyra said carefully, her eyes not meeting his. Once the winter season passes, we should. You don't have to leave, Elric interrupted, the word surprising even himself. Not until you have somewhere safe to go. The hope that flashed across Lyra's face was quickly masked, but not before Elric had seen it. We can't ask that of you, she said. This arrangement was only meant to be temporary. Nothing's permanent, Elric agreed, thinking of all he had lost. But for now, this is working. It was as close as he could come to asking them to stay. That night, after the children were asleep, Lyra found Elric outside on the small covered porch, watching the aurora that sometimes appeared in Xylos's night sky after strong solar activity. The rippling curtains of green and blue light cast an otherworldly glow across the snow-covered landscape. It's beautiful, Lyra said, wrapping a thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders as she joined him. We have something similar on my homeworld, though in different colors. What colors? Elric asked. Purples and golds, mainly. They say it's the breath of the ancestors watching over us. A sad smile crossed her face. I always found the science explanation more comforting, personally. Atmospheric particulates interacting with solar radiation. Predictable. Understandable. You were a scientist too? Elric realized how little he actually knew about her beyond her status as a fugitive and a mother. Lyra nodded. Xenobotanist. I studied how plants adapt to non-native environments. It was fascinating work, finding the balance between genetic modification and environmental adaptation. She gazed up at the aurora. Never and I met through research. He believed environments could be healed rather than just exploited. It was not a popular position among those funding our colony's expansion. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the lights dance across the sky. Did you mean what you said? Lyra finally asked, her voice barely audible above the soft whistle of the wind. About us staying? Elric considered his answer carefully. 3 months ago, the thought of sharing his sanctuary with anyone would have been unthinkable. Now, the prospect of returning to his solitude felt hollow. Yes, he said simply. I meant it. Lyra turned to look at him directly, her violet eyes reflecting the aurora's glow. Why? It was a fair question, one Elric had been asking himself. Because when I look at Kale and Alara, I see. He struggled to find the words. I see possibility. Something I thought was gone. And when you look at me? The question was soft, tentative, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Before Elric could respond, the cabin's alarm system blared to life. A piercing wail designed to alert him to approaching vessels. They both turned toward the sound, the moment shattered. Stay here, Elric commanded, already moving toward the door, military instincts taking over. Inside, he grabbed his pulse rifle and activated the security system's visual feed. The children were awake, startled by the alarm. Kale already placing himself protectively in front of his sister. Lyra rushed in behind Elric, her face pale with fear. Is it them? She asked, her voice tight. Have they found us? Elric studied the readout, his expression grim. Unknown vessel, atmosphere capable, scanning pattern consistent with a search operation. He looked up at Lyra. You need to hide. The next hours were a blur of urgent activity. Elric revealed a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's floor, a safeguard from his more paranoid early days on Xylos. Large enough for Lyra and the children, stocked with emergency supplies and shielded from standard scanning technology. How long have you had this? Lyra asked as she helped the children into the space. Since I built the cabin, Elric replied, checking the air filtration system. Old habits. Once they were safely concealed, Elric secured the hidden door and moved efficient around the cabin, removing any trace of their presence. Children's drawings hidden away, extra sleeping pallets stowed, personal items concealed. He then positioned himself near the main entrance, weapon ready, and waited. The vessel landed approximately 2 kilometers from the cabin, close enough to be intentional, but far enough to suggest caution rather than outright aggression. Through his enhanced viewing scope, Elric could see it was a mid-sized cruiser with starry markings, sleek, expensive, well-maintained. The kind of ship owned by someone with significant resources. 3 figures emerged, making their way toward his cabin through the snow. Their environmental suits obscured their features, but their movements were purposeful, determined. Elric adjusted his weapon's settings and prepared for confrontation. The knock when it came was firm, authoritative. Nothing like Lyra's desperate plea that stormy night that now seemed so long ago. Elric opened the door just enough to present himself, but block any view of the interior. "Private property," he said coldly. "State your business." The leader of the group removed their helmet, revealing the blue-skinned features of a male Thari. Older, with elaborate facial markings that Elric recognized as indicators of high social status. "Human," this Thari said, his standard heavily accented but precise. "I am Elder Voss of this Thari conclave. We seek fugitives, a female and 2 juveniles who fled legal custody. Our tracking systems indicate they were in this vicinity." Elric kept his expression neutral. "I've been alone here for 3 years. No visitors until now." The Elder's eyes, a deeper purple than Lyra's, narrowed slightly. "The settlement records indicate you acquired medical supplies recently. Specifically, treatments suitable for his Thari physiology. A calculated risk that had come back to haunt them." Elric shrugged. "I maintain comprehensive medical supplies. This is an isolated outpost. Preparedness is survival. Then you would not object to us examining your dwelling?" The question was phrased politely, but the intent was clear. "I would," Elric said flatly. Colonial Settlement Act, Section 12. Private dwellings are inviolable without authorization from colonial magistrate or evidence of criminal activity. Do you have either? The Elder's companions shifted, one placing a hand near what Elric suspected was a concealed weapon. The tension in the air thickened. "These fugitives have violated sacred Thari law," the Elder said, his voice hardening. "The female has abducted children rightfully placed under conclave protection. This is a matter of Thari sovereignty." "Not on a colonial planet," Elric countered. "I suggest you take your concerns to the colonial authorities in North Pass." "We have already spoken with your authorities," the Elder said smoothly. "They were most cooperative. In fact, they provided the information about your unusual medical purchases." A chill that had nothing to do with Xylos's temperature ran through Elric. If the Thari had already secured colonial cooperation, Lyra's fears were well-founded. They truly had nowhere to go. "Then I suggest you return with the proper documentation," Elric said, beginning to close the door. "Until then, this conversation is over." The Elder placed a hand on the door, preventing its closure. "I think not, human. Our scanners detected multiple heat signatures within your dwelling before they were suddenly obscured." His smile was cold. "Curious technology for a simple hermit." Elric's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on his weapon's trigger. "Final warning. Remove your hand and leave my property." For a tense moment, neither moved. Then, the Elder slowly withdrew his hand, his expression calculating. "Very well. But know this, the female and her offspring are considered property of the Conclave. Harboring them is interference in Thari sovereign matters. Your colonial authorities will not protect you in this." "Noted," Elric said flatly, and closed the door. He watched through the security feed as the Thari delegation returned to their vessel. They didn't depart immediately, instead establishing what appeared to be a temporary camp. A clear message. They weren't leaving until they got what they came for. Only when he was certain they couldn't observe did Elric open the hidden compartment. Lyra emerged first, her face ashen, having clearly heard every word of the exchange. The children followed, Kale's expression a mirror of his mother's fear, Ilera clinging tightly to her brother's hand. "They found us," Lyra whispered. "Just as I feared. They suspect, but don't know for certain," Elric corrected, already moving to the communications array he rarely used. "But we need a plan. They won't leave empty-handed." "What can we do?" Lyra asked, desperation edging into her voice. "If the colonial authorities are cooperating with them." Elric's hands moved rapidly over the communications console, bypassing the standard channels and accessing a heavily encrypted frequency, one he hadn't used since his military days. "Not all authorities are the same," he said grimly. and I still have a few contacts who owe me favors. Throughout the night, Elric worked tirelessly at his communications array, while Lyra kept the children calm and quiet. By morning, his eyes were red-rimmed from fatigue, but there was a determined set to his jaw. "I have a potential solution," he told Lyra, keeping his voice low, "but you need to understand what it entails." He explained his plan, calling in favors from former military contacts to secure new identities and passage to a distant colony world beyond Sthari influence. It would mean leaving everything behind, starting completely anew, living under assumed names in an unfamiliar place. "We're already living that reality," Lyra said with a sad smile. "At least this would give the children a chance at stability." Elric hesitated, then added the final, crucial detail. "The documentation. It would list you as a family unit. All four of us." Understanding dawned in Lyra's eyes. "You would claim us as your family?" "On paper only," he hastened to add. "It's the simplest explanation for a human traveling with Sthari dependence. Once you're safely established, you could make other arrangements." Lyra studied him for a long moment. "And you would come with us? Leave this place, your sanctuary?" Elric looked around the cabin that had been his refuge and prison for 3 years. In the corner, Alara had fallen asleep against her brother's shoulder, both children exhausted from fear and confinement. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with how right the decision felt. "I would." The preparations had to be made in secret, with the Sthari vessel maintaining its vigil nearby. Elric's contact had arranged for a cargo transport to make an unscheduled stop at his location in 3 days' time. A vessel large enough that a few extra passengers wouldn't be noticed, with a captain willing to look the other way for the right price. Those 3 days became a strange limbo of tension and unexpected intimacy. Confined to the cabin with the constant threat of discovery, they were forced into closer quarters than ever before. They spoke in hushed tones, planned for contingencies, and shared more of their stories to pass the anxious hours. It was during this time that Elric truly came to know the children. Kale revealed a keen intelligence and analytical mind that reminded Elric of the best engineers he'd served with. The boy peppered him with questions about spaceship engines, colonial defense systems, and survival tactics, absorbing the information with serious concentration. Alara, with a child's remarkable adaptability, treated their confinement as an adventure. She created elaborate stories about their future home, drew pictures of the 4 of them together under alien skies, and chattered about the plants and animals she hoped to see on a warmer world. And Lyra, Elric found himself drawn to her strength, her resilience, her fierce dedication to her children. In quiet moments when the children slept, they spoke of their lost partners, their abandoned careers, their hopes and fears. The walls between them, already cracked, began to crumble entirely. On the afternoon before their planned departure, Elric was checking his supplies one final time when Lyra joined him, her expression troubled. "The Sthari aren't leaving," she said, nodding toward the security feed that showed the vessel still in position. "They'll see us the moment we try to reach the transport landing zone." Elric had been considering this problem. "I have an idea, but you won't like it." His plan was simple but risky. Create a diversion significant enough to draw attention away from their escape route. Specifically, setting the cabin's power core to overload, causing a controlled but impressive explosion that would demand investigation. "This has been your home for years," Lyra protested. "Everything you've built." "It's just a place," Elric said, surprised to find he meant it. "What matters is getting you and the children to safety." Lyra's violet eyes shimmered with emotion. "Why are you doing all this for us?" "The truth, Elric." The question hung between them, demanding an answer he had been avoiding even in his own thoughts. Elric looked away, organizing tools with unnecessary precision. "When you appeared at my door that night," he finally said, "you offered to warm my bed in exchange for shelter. A desperate bargain." He met her gaze directly. "But in these weeks, you've warmed something else entirely. Something I thought was dead." Lyra stepped closer, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her blue skin, the depth of her violet eyes. "And what was that?" "Hope," he said simply. the possibility of a life beyond mere survival. The distance between them vanished as Lyra reached up to touch his face, her fingers cool against his skin. "I stopped believing in possibilities the day Nevar died," she whispered, "until you opened your door to us." When their lips met, it wasn't with passion or desperation, but with a gentle acknowledgement of something that had been growing between them, fragile, unexpected, and real. They were interrupted by a small gasp. Turning, they found Alara watching them with wide eyes and a delighted smile. "I knew it," she exclaimed in a stage whisper. "Kale said you were just being nice because you felt sorry for us, but I told him you looked at Mama the way the prince looks at the princess in my stories." Lyra laughed softly, the sound a bright contrast to the tension that had filled the cabin for days. She knelt before her daughter, smoothing back her hair. "Is that all right with you, little one?" Alara nodded enthusiastically. "Does this mean Elric really will be our new father? Not just pretend for the papers?" The question, innocent and direct as only a child's could be, hung in the air. Elric found himself meeting Kale's gaze, the boy having appeared silently behind his sister. The wariness in those young eyes had been replaced by something more complex. Hope tempered with caution, wanting to believe but afraid to trust. Elric knelt, placing himself at eye level with both children. "I cannot replace your father," he said carefully, "and I would never try to. But if you'll allow it, I would be honored to help your mother keep you safe and to be part of your family." Kale studied him with an intensity that belied his young age. "You would leave your home for us? Fight the elders for us?" Without hesitation, Elric replied, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. A moment passed, a critical evaluation. Then Kale extended his hand in a very human gesture he must have learned from observing Elric. "Then I accept you." Elric took the small blue hand in his, feeling the weight of the moment, the commitment it represented. Alara, never one for restraint, launched herself at him in a tight hug. Over their heads, his eyes met Lyra's, seeing in them a mirror of his own emotions. Wonder, fear, and something that might, with time and nurturing, grow into love. The tender moment was shattered by the sudden wail of proximity alarms. Elric was on his feet instantly, checking the security feed. The Sthari delegation was approaching the cabin, this time with what appeared to be scanning equipment. "They're done waiting," he said grimly. "We need to move now." What followed was a frantic rush of activity. The original plan had been to wait for nightfall, but circumstances had forced their hand. Elric quickly programmed the power core's overload sequence while Lyra gathered their minimal belongings. The children, sensing the urgency, moved with quiet efficiency, helping where they could. "The blast will be contained mostly within the cabin structure," Elric explained as he worked, "but the electromagnetic pulse should disable their scanning equipment temporarily. We'll have maybe 10 minutes to reach the rendezvous point before they recover." They exited through a maintenance hatch in the rear of the cabin, designed for accessing external systems during severe weather. The cold hit them immediately, Xylos's bitter wind cutting through even their thermal gear. Elric led them toward a small ridge of ice formations that would provide cover for their escape route. Behind them, the Sthari delegation had reached the cabin door. Through his portable scanner, Elric could see them attempting to override his security protocols. They had minutes at most. "Stay low, move quickly," he instructed, helping Alara navigate the difficult terrain. The rendezvous point is just beyond that ice ridge. They had covered perhaps half the distance when Elric's remote detonator signaled readiness. He hesitated only briefly before activating the sequence. Moments later, the peaceful Xylos landscape was illuminated by a brilliant flash as the cabin's power core overloaded. The explosion wasn't large. Elric had calibrated it carefully to create maximum disruption with minimal dangerous debris, but in the stark whiteness of Xylos, it was spectacular. A plume of fire and smoke rose into the sky, followed by the secondary explosions of stored fuel cells and compressed gases. The Sthari delegation reacted as anticipated, rushing toward the burning structure with scanners and emergency equipment. The distraction was perfect, but brief. They needed to move now. "Run," Elric urged, lifting Alara into his arms to increase their speed. The child clung to him, her face pressed against his shoulder to shield from the biting wind. They reached the ice ridge just as Elric's scanner showed the first Thari life signs moving away from the cabin fire and beginning a search pattern. The race was on. Beyond the ridge, the landing zone came into view, a relatively flat expanse where the cargo transport could safely touch down. But it was exposed, offering no cover for the final approach. Once they left the shelter of the ice formations, they would be visible to anyone scanning the area. "The transport is on approach," Elric said, checking his communications device. 5 minutes out. "We need to time this perfectly." They huddled in the meager shelter of the ice, catching their breath, preparing for the final dash. Kale, despite his recovering health, showed no signs of weakness, his young face set in determined lines. Lyra held Alara close, whispering reassurances. Elric's scanner beeped a warning. Thari life signs approaching their position. They had been tracked despite the disruption. "Change of plans," he said grimly, handing his pack to Lyra. "I'm going to lead them away. When the transport lands, you take the children and go." "No." Lyra's response was immediate, vehement. "We go together or not at all." "This isn't a discussion," Elric said, checking his weapon. "The children need you. If I can buy you enough time to get aboard." "Then what?" Lyra demanded. "We leave you behind. After everything you've done, everything we've—" She couldn't finish the sentence, emotion choking her words. "I'll find you," Elric promised, though they both knew how unlikely that would be if you were captured. "There's no time to argue." But before he could move, Kale spoke up, his young voice steady despite the circumstances. "There's another way. The ice cave." Elric and Lyra both turned to the boy in confusion. "When you took me outside during my recovery," Kale explained quickly, "you showed me an ice cave formation not far from here. You said it confused scanner readings because of mineral deposits in the ice." Elric stared at the boy in astonishment. He had indeed mentioned this in passing during one of their excursions. A purely academic observation he hadn't expected a child to remember or understand the significance of. "It's too far," he began, but Kale was already pointing. "It's just there," he insisted. "We passed it. If some of us go in, the readings will show confusing patterns. They'll have to split up to investigate." It was a desperate gambit, but a better option than Elric's suicide diversion. "You're brilliant," he told Kale, earning a rare smile from the serious boy. "Lyra, take Alara to the cave. Kale and I will create false trails, then join you. When the Thari split up to investigate, we make our run for the transport." The plan unfolded with tense precision. Lyra and Alara reached the small ice cave, little more than a deep recess in a glacial formation, but large enough to shelter them and, crucially, lined with the mineral deposits that disrupted standard scanners. Meanwhile, Elric and Kale moved in a wide arc, deliberately leaving clear tracks in the snow before doubling back through a rocky area that wouldn't hold footprints. The Thari search party, now numbering 6, reacted as hoped. Their scanners showing confusing, scattered readings, they divided into pairs to investigate different signals. None approached the landing zone directly. When the transport's engines were audible, descending through Xylos's thin upper atmosphere, Elric gave the signal. They emerged from their hiding places and made the final dash across open ground toward the landing zone. The cargo vessel was massive, industrial, and wonderfully unremarkable, the kind that serviced dozens of frontier worlds with essential supplies. Its loading ramp was already descending as they approached, a single figure standing at its base. Elric's contact, a woman with the hard eyes and practical stance of someone who had seen her share of desperate situations. Cutting it close, "Elric," she called over the roar of the engines. "Your payment better be as good as promised." "Every credit," he assured her, hurrying Lyra and the children up the ramp. "As discussed, no records, no questions." The woman nodded, her eyes lingering briefly on the unusual family group before she turned to secure the ramp. "Get to the crew quarters, sublevel B. Stay there until I come for you after jump." They had barely reached the designated quarters when the vessel shuddered, lifting off from Xylos's surface. Through a small viewport, Elric caught a final glimpse of the burning remains of his cabin. The starry search party now converged and clearly signaling their vessel. But it was too late. The transport was already pushing through the upper atmosphere, preparing for the jump to faster-than-light travel. Only when the viewport showed the star-streaked patterns of FTL travel did they truly allow themselves to believe they had escaped. The quarters were cramped, utilitarian, meant for junior crew members during long hauls. But to the four fugitives, it was sanctuary. Alara, exhausted from the ordeal, fell asleep almost immediately on one of the narrow bunks. Kale lasted longer, his adrenaline keeping him alert as he examined the cabin's systems with fascination, but eventually succumbed to fatigue as well, curled protectively near his sister. Left alone in the relative quiet, Lyra and Elric sat side by side on the remaining bunk, the events of the day catching up with them in a rush of delayed reaction. "We made it," Lyra whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. "I can't believe we actually made it. Your son saved us," Elric said with genuine admiration. His quick thinking made the difference. "Our son," Lyra corrected gently, watching his reaction. "If you meant what you said back there." Elric took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with her slender blue ones. "I meant every word. I want to build something with you, Lyra. A real family, not just papers and pretense." "It won't be easy," she warned. "We'll be fugitives for years, perhaps always. The children will face challenges as hybrids of two cultures. And you and I," she hesitated. "We hardly know each other. Not really." "I know enough," Elric said with quiet certainty. "I know you're brave and brilliant and would do anything for your children. I know Kale has the mind of an engineer and the heart of a protector. I know Alara sees beauty and possibility everywhere, even on a frozen world." He squeezed her hand gently. "The rest we learn together." Lyra leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Why, I knocked on your door that night, offering to warm your bed. It was desperation. A transaction for survival. And now?" Elric asked, his arms slipping around her shoulders. She looked up at him, a smile transforming her features. "Now it will be a choice, freely made." Their kiss was different this time, deeper, a promise rather than a revelation. When they parted, Lyra rested her forehead against his. "Where do we go from here?" Truly, Elric had been considering this question since setting the escape plan in motion. The colony on Verdun. It's far enough from Thari influence to be safe, diverse enough that a mixed family won't draw attention, and my contact says they need engineers and botanists for their terraforming project. A place where both our skills would be valued, Lyra mused. Where the children could have education, stability. "A home," Elric said, the word feeling strange but right on his tongue. "Not just a shelter or a hiding place. A real Oma." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sleeping children, each lost in thoughts of the future they might build together. After a while, Lyra spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "There's a tradition among my people. When families are formed or joined, they plant a garden together, each member contributing something that represents their hopes for the union. Not much grows on Xylos," Elric observed. "No," Lyra agreed with a small laugh. "But Verdun, from what you've described, things grow there. Perhaps not easily, being a terraforming project, but possible. Then we'll plant a garden," Elric promised. "The four of us." The transport continued its journey through the star-streaked corridors of FTL travel, carrying its unusual family to an uncertain future. There would be challenges ahead, legal documents to secure, identities to establish, a life to build from nothing. The starry conclave would not abandon their search easily, and the shadow of discovery would always loom. But as Elric looked at the sleeping children and the woman beside him, he felt something he had thought forever lost in the ashes of his former life. It wasn't just hope, though that burned bright. It wasn't just purpose, though that gave him strength. It was warmth. The warmth of connection, of belonging, of family. The kind of warmth that could thrive even on the coldest of worlds. 6 months later, on the developing colony world of Verdun, A small ceremony took place in the fledgling botanical gardens. A family of four, a human man with the watchful eyes of someone who had seen too much war, a Sthari woman whose gentle hands coaxed life from alien soil, a serious boy who had recently been accepted into the colony's engineering apprentice program despite his young age, and a spirited girl who charmed everyone with her stories and drawings, gathered to plant a garden of their own. Elric watched as Kale carefully measured the plot, ensuring each plant would have optimal space and sunlight. Alara danced around them, singing a Sthari melody Lyra had taught her, stopping occasionally to place colorful stones she had collected to mark the garden's boundary. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked, handing him a small container of seeds. "What are these?" he asked, examining the unfamiliar dark pods. "Frost lilies," she explained. "From my homeworld. They bloom in the harshest conditions, even in snow and ice. They represent endurance, survival against odds." She smiled up at him. "They reminded me of you." Elric held the seeds carefully, thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From the bitter isolation of Xylos to this warm, hopeful place. From strangers bound by desperate circumstance to a family bound by choice. "They're perfect," he said, kneeling to plant them in the freshly turned soil. One by one, they each added their contributions to the garden. Kale's precisely arranged tubers that would grow into tall, structural plants providing shade and support for the more delicate species. Alara's wildflower seeds scattered with joyful abandon, promising riots of color. Lyra's carefully cultivated hybrid species that combined elements of her homeworld's flora with Verdon's native plants. Together, they watered the newly planted garden, this small patch of earth that symbolized everything they had found in each other. Protection, joy, wisdom, and the courage to grow something new from the ashes of the past. As the twin suns of Verdon began to set, casting long shadows across their new home, Elric gathered his family close. The anxious, broken soldier who had once sought only isolation now found his greatest peace in these connections. "What are you thinking?" Lyra asked, seeing his contemplative expression. Elric looked at each of them in turn. Kale, steadfast and brilliant. Alara, bright and fearless. Lyra, brave and nurturing. And finally found the words for what he had gained the night. He opened his door to a desperate plea. "I'm thinking that you didn't just warm my bed," he said softly. "You thawed my heart." In the garden they had planted together, new life was already taking root, reaching upward toward the light, just as they were, one day at a time, growing together into something beautiful and resilient. A family forged not by blood or tradition, but by choice and love and the shared understanding that home wasn't a place, but people who would brave any storm to keep each other safe.